For the last take 5, a little review of communism. Everyone did very well. And the reason we're talking about communism is because at the end of this war, Soviet Russia will have quite a bit of power. So the political opposite of communism would be widespread democracy, consistent participation of the public in making decisions about their government. Economically, the opposite of communism would be laissez-faire capitalism, the choice of the individual rather than everything being decided by the government. So let's talk about the end of the war. The end of April, as Hitler realizes that on both sides armies are coming closer and closer to Berlin, he decides to commit suicide. Many of the Nazi leaders did that rather than being captured and prosecuted for their massive war crimes. They kill themselves. So then the Nazi generals are left to decide what to do, and they decide to surrender very wisely. So that officially takes place on May 8th, 1945. So that is called Victory in Europe, or VE Day, and there was widespread relief, celebrations, in particular in Britain, these communities that have been under the threat of war for nearly 6 years, extreme rationing. Everyone pools together their supplies and their resources to throw a big party. This is such a relief. But the thing is, the war isn't entirely over yet. There still is the war in the Pacific. Now, if we look at the map, this map is from 1939. So much of what happens in the Pacific starts off as leftover tension from the colonial era. We have Australia and New Zealand, which are technically British. Then we have these in yellow territories controlled by Great Britain, including islands and India and sort of Thailand. Then there's the Dutch. And look at how much the Japanese have. Remember, we've talked about the Japanese wanting to extend a sphere of influence to prove that they are the most powerful in their neighborhood. And this is the result of the Meiji era being forced to open to the West. Some of the island groups they received after World War I, like the Caroline, Marianas, and Marshall Islands. Japan had done this, taken much of this territory, especially on the mainland, Korea, Manchuria, and China. They'd been very aggressive in doing this. And so this makes everyone else in the neighborhood a little bit nervous. They're nervous about their colonies. Even America has the Philippines. They're nervous about this Japanese aggression. Many important battles, but since this is a European class, we're just going to very quickly go over some of the big ones. We've got the Battle of Midway, which is midway between the U.S. and Japan. And because the Pacific Ocean is so vast, it was important to control these islands. So whoever could control Midway would have a refueling station, could have an airfield from which to conduct further battles. So the Allies win this, and it's a pretty big turning point. The general tactic that will be used in the Pacific is called island hopping. The Allies want to reclaim this whole corridor of islands from the Japanese, and rather than fighting hand-to-hand combat, they decided to use air power to take back, to have sort of these bombing campaigns to force the Japanese to retreat. Another reason why the Allies didn't necessarily want to fight hand-to-hand was they wanted to limit the number of prisoners of war who were taken by the Japanese. The Japanese treated their prisoners abominably. They would send them on forced marches, use them as forced labor, and all of this in this really harsh, hot, humid climate. Here we have a famous photograph of an Australian officer about to be beheaded by a samurai sword. And this is part of the reason why the Japanese were such a difficult foe. By this point in the war, by spring 1945, the Japanese are the only ones left from their allies. The Germans and the Italians are out of the war, so the Japanese are all that's left, and they refuse to give up. And this really comes from that sort of samurai Bushido tradition, that you fight to the last, you fight for your honor. We see this at Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was a volcanic island, and the Japanese had dug series of caves all throughout. They were willing to hold on to that island. It wasn't that they needed to farm or anything, but it was the proximity to Japan, that it could be used as an airfield to then launch bombing campaigns over Japan. Again, using that fight to the last mentality. And the Allies just are exhausted. They have risked so many men, so many lives. At Iwo Jima, by this point in the war, it was very common for journalists to be traveling to send back information of what's going on. And he wanted to capture the American success and victory on the island of Iwo Jima. The tallest point was Mount Suribachi. So this was the photo he wanted to get. And when he was testing his camera, this was another photo he took. This becomes the famous photo and the inspiration for the Iwo Jima Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. So the Pacific Campaign, the Pacific Theater in general, very, very costly. And the British and Americans have to decide, are they willing to continue fighting this war if the costs are going to continue in the same fashion? They decide they aren't, which is why it was so important to use the atomic bomb. This had been developed over a number of years by the Manhattan Project, and there were a few tests that were done using this weapon. They dropped the first bomb over Hiroshima, and the Americans are hoping, the British are hoping as well, that the impact, the size of this bomb would convince the Japanese to surrender. But they don't. Again, that Bushido Code. So the Americans dropped the second bomb over Nagasaki. Now you can see here's an aerial photograph before the bomb, and below is after. It just wipes out this community, and it was a calculated risk. The Allies knew that there would be heavy losses. They had targeted economic centers rather than population centers, but there was quite a heavy loss of life. But the alternative was to continue fighting to the death. After the second bomb is dropped, the Japanese decide that they do want to surrender. So here in the Western Hemisphere, it was August 14th, and in the Japanese time zone, it was August 15th. So we have victory in Japan. So finally, this war is over. Just such relief, such rejoicing. We have the very famous photograph in Times Square. Here is the body count. Nearly 60 million people killed as a result of this war. This was definitely a world war in terms of the territories where it was fought, the countries represented, the people who were killed. This war really demonstrates the power of modern science, either for good or for evil. So why did we win? First of all, the Allies were able to produce more. This is both from the Soviet Union and the United States. We have the Americans who start producing in the 1930s, who are selling and then lending products to Britain, and that's possible because America's not involved in war, so they can be producing things. And then as a result of Stalin's 5-year plans, that this massive production gave the Allies more supplies. Then we have the entry of the U.S. as of December 7th, 1941. The British had been fighting for 2 years by that point, and they needed more help, more than just economic or supplies. They needed manpower, and the Americans provide that. Now, that's not to say that you should tell someone who is British, you're welcome. I would not suggest that. While our entry in the war was a very important element, we cannot forget the work that had been done by the British, that their country had been under attack constantly for years, and the sacrifices that the British people made. We also have all of the weapons that are developed or improved upon, the use of radar, which will be important from here on out, the way planes were adapted either for dogfighting or for bombing, all of these different variations, and then of course the atomic weapons. As this war is coming to a close, the Allies need to decide what will happen next. So the first major instance of this is at Yalta. It's a Crimean resort town. And we have Britain, America, and the Soviet Union represented. So Churchill, President Roosevelt, and Stalin. one of the biggest things they decide is what to do with Germany. By February 45, it was very clear that Germany would lose. It was just a matter of time. Now, they could take a page from the Treaty of Versailles and take away territory, force them to pay reparations, punish them. But as they saw, that did not work, and that caused war. So Germany is allowed to stay Germany. Germany keeps its borders, and it will just be occupied and sort of babysat by these allied nations. So here we can see the territories. And still in that pink, those areas that will be controlled by the U.S., we still have a number of American air bases and military outposts. The other issue is that the British and Americans asked Stalin, if the war lasts much longer, would Stalin get involved in the Pacific? Stalin absolutely did not want to. He felt that he had done his part. He had disabled the Germans enough in the Eastern Front in the Battle of Stalingrad that he didn't need to sacrifice anymore. Then, once the war in Europe is done, they need to come up with a few more specifics. So they do that at Potsdam, which is just outside of Berlin. Same countries, but different people. We'll start with America. President Franklin Roosevelt had died. He had been ill for quite some time, and so his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over. So we still have Stalin. And then we have Clement Attlee, the new British Prime Minister. When the war was over, Britain holds elections, as they hadn't for so long because of the war. Churchill, the man who had led the British people through the war, through a few harsh policies, rationing, sort of that sense of the stiff upper lip that the British have. He looked to a future after the war where the people would pull themselves up by the bootstraps. The British people were exhausted and they wanted more help from the government. They wanted more services provided. And that's what Clement Attlee's party offered. So the man who led Britain through the war is not re-elected, and Clement Attlee takes his place. The biggest thing decided at the Potsdam Conference is what to do with Berlin. We've talked about the capital cities being very symbolic. Berlin is in the heart of the Soviet-controlled part of Germany, but they decide to divide the city itself just because it is so symbolic. And we see here East and West Berlin. All of this will lead to some of our topics in the Cold War. The other major thing is Stalin is rewarded with Eastern Europe. Remember, he argued that his disabling of Germany at Stalingrad and on the Eastern Front was so significant that the Allies would not have won the war without Stalin's efforts. And his consolation prize, his goodie bag, is this territory. Now we look at all of this, these territories that had been controlled and conquered by the Nazis, now conquered and controlled by another dictator. Now, why would the Allies do this? Why would they agree to this? Well, even though Russia, Britain, and America were allies, they were truly frenemies. Britain and America had no love for Stalin, but at the time, they all had a common enemy in Hitler. Now that Germany has been eliminated, there is tension between the Soviet Union and the West. So rather than fight each other, they agree to this compromise, and it will take us directly into the Cold War.